Congressman Chip Roy. Welcome to TPPF. Congressman Chip Roy, thanks for joining us. All of you who are here, thanks for making time out of your busy schedules for this. I'm Kevin Roberts, the Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I know that one of the great things about Congressional District 21, which we're in by about a block, and extends far out into the hill country, is that there are great people, a great congressman, regardless of whatever we think about his political views, a great guy, and a diversity of opinion. And if this is the first time you've been to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, you know that, of course, we do have a particular worldview, which is something we are not afraid of saying. But we also are one of those institutions, even if we have a difference of opinion, that adheres to the belief that civil discourse does not require a unanimity of opinion. So everyone's view here tonight is welcome. I can tell you that the congressman believes the same thing. I will, however, emphasize, as the old Catholic school headmaster I am, that civil discourse does require civility. And so we are going to ask, once we get to that point of having questions from the audience, that you adhere to that. We hope, Congressman and I, that we will be doing that ourselves. And if the roles were reversed and you were the member of Congress moderating the discussion and we were the ones asking the question, we would try to adhere to that as well. We are hopeful here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation that by going through our work that way, by working with groups on left and right on every issue that we can restore in America an optimism that people can disagree on certain issues, agree on others, and in the meantime, shake hands and decide that we want a healthy Texas and a healthy America. So with that said, thank you, Congressman, again for being here. A brief introduction. Congressman Chip Roy is in his first term representing Congressional District 21. He is someone who has a rather long history in Texas politics and policy. He's worked for both U.S. senators. He was Chief of Staff for Attorney General Paxton. And as many of you know, he spent a little bit of time here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. If you don't know Congressman Roy well and have not met me, you will not know that our close friendship will not prevent me from asking hard questions. So if you know anything about friendships between guys, you know that in fact this might be a little bit of fun, right? So with that said, I have invited Congressman Roy to provide some opening comments. I think we will all benefit from hearing how he's seeing things in DC. I'm going to ask him a few questions. My desire there is not to dominate the Q&A. We'll turn it over to you as soon as we can, and we will maximize the time we have tonight. Congressman Roy.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all of you all for coming out here this evening. It's great to be back at TPPF, and I do take to heart. I know there's some here in the room who may not share my ideology or necessarily the ideology of TPPF, but spoke with Kevin about this is a great facility in the heart of Austin, Texas, and we like to have open, deliberative debate about the things that come up in public policy, and wanted to have an event here. And I want to have as many public forums and town halls as I can do, recognizing that I'm spending 3 weeks out of every month in DC, and when you're back in the work period, you're making a lot of trips around the district to make sure you're visiting with constituents and folks. And so we do the most we can. We've got another one tomorrow in San Antonio that will be veteran specific, and that'll be our fourth town hall in what is now my fourth month. So trying to do what we can to be out and active, engaged in the community. Appreciate your time being here. Appreciate Kevin's point about some friendly sparring. I hope I'll ask some tough questions. Last Monday, 2 weeks ago, I took my dad, who's 76, and is a graduate of Texas Tech, and took him to Minneapolis. It was a last-minute decision on Saturday night after Texas Tech made the championship game, and it was great. And it was great to take him there. And he is a polio survivor, and it took some finagling, figuring out how to get it all to work, and we managed to make it work. And that would seem like a really magnanimous thing for a son to do for his father until you know that the son went to the University of Virginia. So it was one of those kind of bittersweet things. I kind of thought it was going to be a win-win, and then the way the game turned out, with Virginia pulling it out at the very end, I was sitting with him, and I was around some other Texas Tech people, and I was kind of like crawling to the back of the hallway. But it was a great time, and it was a great run for Texas Tech basketball, and great for the state of Texas. I'm delighted to be here. This is the middle of, or sort of the beginning of the second week of a 2-week work period. Last week I spent time in San Antonio, spent time in San Marcos, New Braunfels, Fredericksburg. Back in San Antonio, the highlight of the week was being at the funeral, really it was a memorial service for Lieutenant Colonel Cole, who you might know was the last surviving member of the Doolittle raid, and listening to the account of his life and what went into that unbelievable effort by the United States to respond to Japan in the spring of 1942 was extraordinary. And it was a life well lived. He passed away at 103, and his family was magnificent. But it was inspiring being there with a lot of servicemen and servicewomen, and that reminds me why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's been an interesting over 100 days now. I don't know exactly what the count is. Walking in with your election certificate into the minority in a shutdown is an interesting environment in which to begin your elective public service. But, I think that a lot of important issues are being brought to light and as a focus of important conversation. And I think we'll get into this more in a minute, issue by issue. But, when I ran for this seat, I did so believing that it was important to focus on balancing the budget and getting our fiscal house in order, restoring healthcare freedoms so that we can get access to the doctors of our choosing at an affordable cost, making sure that we secure our border and restoring sovereignty and making sure that we enforce the rule of law, make sure our men and women have a clear mission, the tools to conduct it, and the care when they get home, and then largely Washington getting out of the way of the state of Texas and the people who make this country great. And that's what I ran on, and that's what I'm trying to execute on in Washington. It's what I'm trying to focus on like a laser. And obviously, immigration has been front and center. Spending, I'm proud to be on the Budget Committee, on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and the Oversight Committee. Trying not to get whipsawed too much by the news of the day, which is too often the case, and stay focused on those things that I campaigned on, and trying to vote consistent with those things in a environment where it's not always easy to know what's happening with the majority in charge throwing votes at you at the last minute. And and we'll get into this again in a minute. Importantly, trying to make sure in representing Texas 21, it's not reflexively Republican or reflexively pro-President Trump or anti-President Trump or anything else. It's reflecting the values that I ran on and reflects the values of Texas 21. There's been a number of times where I've voted counter to the party and voted counter to what some might think would be the president's choice. I voted, for example, to suggest that we shouldn't be in Yemen, and taking a position that I think, and I think, look, and this is an issue that crosses aisles, but I think it's important for us to have a robust debate about a 17-year-old authorization of force and what we're doing with our men and women in uniform. There's a number of other areas that we can get into issue by issue, but front and center obviously has been immigration and border security, and I'm sure we'll address that, and then spending, which I'm happy to get into in a little bit. But I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate you all showing up tonight and participating in the process.
So, Congressman, curious, just general impressions. You've been in D.C. now for several months. What have been surprises about what you would characterize as the swamp? Have any of those surprises been pleasant?
So surprises and pleasant surprises. Look, pleasant surprises, almost a fifth of the House of Representatives is represented by freshmen. And I have been pleasantly surprised by the energy, enthusiasm, dedication, skill, commitment to America on both sides of the aisle by the freshman class that has come in energized, I think in part to challenge the swamp, even frankly, regardless of party, to kind of challenge the status quo and establish order. You've seen that a little bit in some of the breaks in votes on the Democrat side of the aisle, as well as the Republican side. And I think that there's some encouraging signs in that. I've been very impressed by a number of my colleagues in the freshman class, like Congressman Crenshaw in Houston, who's become a good friend, Congressman Wright from Dallas-Fort Worth area, the number of the folks that I've been working with that I've been very impressed with. I won't go to the list unless I leave some out, but it's been encouraging, including some on the other side of the aisle. Abigail Spanberger from Richmond represents a sort of reddish-purple district in Richmond, Virginia. We were commiserating about Virginia winning the national championship just 2 weeks ago. But we also started talking about spending, budget, AUMF being 17 years old, other issues that we have shared concerns about. And this is, I think, where the nucleus of growing belief that maybe there's another way we ought to be going about figuring out how to govern, particularly on the side of spending. So that's been a pleasant surprise.
So you went up there actually even before you were elected. I believe you announced that you would be a member of the House Freedom Caucus. What was your rationale in doing so, considering, fairly or unfairly, media across the entire spectrum determine or describe the House Freedom Caucus as being extreme?
Well, number one, I'm a loyal guy. The House Freedom Caucus were with me early in a crowded primary. There were 18 people in that primary, and they got in behind me and supported me. So loyalty alone would dictate that I would saddle up with the Freedom Caucus. But it's not just that, because I believe very much that it's a group of individuals that are committed to shockingly freedom. And that shouldn't be such a unbelievable reality that in Washington you've got a group of people committed to freedom. And frankly, I would think people on both sides of the aisle would appreciate the extent to which there's sort of an independent vote there, based on principles and based on ideas that aren't necessarily about party, but really about our belief. And you can disagree with the beliefs, and that's fine. But it is a commitment that, by the way, receives the scorn of those in the leadership in our party quite regularly. If you're taking a position that isn't necessarily at odds with or isn't necessarily in accord with the party. I'll give you an example. Last summer, many of you know this, there was 2 votes on immigration that the House Republican leadership brought to the floor. It took a while to get there. In those votes, there were 2 bills that were similar but had some significant differences. Each bill dealt with border security in a way that would have increased judges, increased fencing, increased assets at the border, funding for Border Patrol, would have done a lot of the things that would be preventing the chaos we're seeing right now at our border. It also would have reformed our immigration system to be point-based instead of points-based and merit-based instead of diversity visas and family chain migration, and would have transformed our immigration system for labor supply and made it a more modern system. It then dealt with status for those here. One of the bills in that status would have had a path to citizenship for 3, 4, 5 million people, depending on how you count and assume that the numbers would have worked. A path to citizenship. The second bill had the same rough structure with a little bit more security and had status only, not path to citizenship special, for just the Dreamer class, give or take. Each of those bills were voted on. Not a single Democrat voted for either bill, not one. 121 Republicans voted for the first bill I described. 191 Republicans voted for the second bill I described. In that lot was the Freedom Caucus. The Freedom Caucus voted for a bill that provided status for the so-called Dreamer class. Now, a lot of the members of the Freedom Caucus don't support doing that as an initial outset. And frankly, a lot of their supporters don't support that. But they were willing to do that in compromise. Yet they're often held up and excoriated as being line in the sand, unwilling to compromise. But who's unwilling to compromise? How about the 0 Democrats that supported either one of those bills that would have vastly modernized our immigration system and would have helped us avoid the state where we have today, where 100,000 people were coming across our border in March alone, 16,000 in Texas alone last week. These are unbelievable numbers, and it's something we could have avoided if we had done what we should have done.
So what's the path forward on immigration? I mean, any observer looks at the landscape. They know that Congress is divided. They understand that the president, for better or for worse, depending on your perspective, has staked out a position that not everyone in Congress agrees with, to put it mildly. We have the media who have glommed on, for better or for worse, into a sometimes sensationalist view of what I see as a crisis. I don't mean that in a way to add to the sensationalism. Those of us who spend our time in public policy trying to focus on solutions sometimes get frustrated by a seeming inability of our elected leaders to take action on one of the most pressing issues facing us. I guess what I'm asking for in a long-winded way is some optimism that some common sense deal can get done on immigration, but what I think most of us in this room would say, regardless of our perspective, is that we're kind of pessimistic that that's going to happen. It seems as if each side has a vested interest in the status quo, which is a real shame considering what's going on at the border.
Well, first, I think it's important to look a little bit about what's happening at the border. Let me offer some perspectives that may or may not be shining through the media presentation. I went down in January to the Rio Grande Valley sector with my friend Dan Crenshaw, met with Border Patrol, met with some people in the media, not in Border Patrol, tried to get a firsthand glimpse of what was happening, sat down at the Rio Grande Valley. We witnessed and talked to a number of people who were crossing the river, talked to them in Spanish, talked about where they'd been, why they were coming, what they were doing as they flowed, literally hundreds that day that I saw personally, get onto buses, get transported around, and then get sent to a processing center before being basically caught and released, right? Get processed and then distributed out into the country. That was what was happening in real time. When we met with Border Patrol, the numbers we were told in January were upwards of about 400,000 people, 400,000 would flow through the Rio Grande Valley sector in the McAllen part of the Rio Grande Valley sector. 200,000 would be apprehended, 200,000 would not be apprehended. Of the 200,000 apprehended, 90% would be caught and released. That was the stats as we knew them in January. Just the other day, I saw the statistics that in the Rio Grande Valley sector, through 7 months, we're already up to 167,000 apprehended individuals through 7 months. We are now on track to 300,000 apprehended, and it's usually a one-for-one number that they see in terms of the numbers that they catch versus that they don't. Now you're looking at upwards of 600,000 coming through the Rio Grande Valley sector. Why is this happening? Because cartels have operational control of our border, period. That is not debatable. The cartels are profiting to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. A report came out just yesterday that cartels are likely made $2 billion moving people, not narcotics, people in 2017 alone. We know that the Reynosa faction of the Gulf Cartel, moving people through the Rio Grande Valley sector, are making hundreds of millions of dollars getting them across, but also keeping them in stash houses and using leverage to get them to make payments back to them once they get across the river. It's a business model. It's a profit-making machine in which they video people coming across the river, send those videos back to families in their home countries or to families that sponsor them in the United States. This is the status of our border. Tamaulipas, the state directly across from McAllen, is a level 4 state under our State Department. That means it's a no-travel zone. It's more dangerous than Honduras, than El Salvador, than places where people are coming from. This is literally across the border of the United States. Why? Because 32,000 people were murdered in Mexico last year. Because Tamaulipas is at the epicenter of that. Because the Gulf Cartel is so powerful and so dangerous. This is the state of our border. 100,000 people apprehended in March alone across our border. This is unsustainable. And this is what's happening. Our Border Patrol is overwhelmed. They can't even process them anymore in trying to catch and release them. And this is causing a burden that we can't sustain. What is the consequences of that? People are getting through who are in fact dangerous. Do we know the exact extent of that? No. But we know through intelligence that MS-13 operations are growing in communities in Texas, including Temple, and places far removed from the border. We know that we've got people coming in that have convictions and crimes and criminal histories that we would want to be aware of if you were processing them normally. We know that there's a problem with narcotics that are flowing, not just at the ports of entry, as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would like you to believe, but the 113 pounds of fentanyl that were caught between the ports of entry in the first 6 months of this fiscal year. 113 pounds of fentanyl. Fentanyl in a sugar packet is enough to kill everybody in this room. 113 pounds of that was caught between the ports of entry. This is an undeniable data point that we talked about in a hearing before the United States House of Representatives. So the path forward, in my opinion, is end cartel ownership of our border, stop allowing cartels to use our asylum laws as a profit center machine by enforcing our asylum laws, making credible fear determinations at our border, which currently are being exploited to get people across our border to move people for profit. So we go to the border, make credible fear determinations. Are you a person who is from a country where you have a credible fear of persecution? That's what our asylum law is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be, are you in a bad economic climate? Do you have a bad state at home? Did you lose your job? All things that are concerning for those individuals, and we as Christians and compassionate individuals should care about. But as a country where sovereignty matters and the rule of law matters, we need to enforce our law at the border between the ports of entry, force people to go to embassies and ports of entry so that we can regain control of our border. That's what I think the president wants to do, but he's getting pushback from Ninth Circuit judges and from bureaucrats in his own administration that they're trying to work through.
Thanks for that. I suspect you'll get some follow-up questions from the audience on that. So we'll move from one easy issue, immigration, to another one, healthcare. So what's the solution on healthcare?
In 30 seconds.
2 minutes or less. Good luck with that.
So I believe, and I'm fairly well public about this, that the solution to healthcare is 180 degrees the opposite of what you're hearing from the left, what you're hearing from Bernie Sanders and believing in universal healthcare, and what you heard AOC say yesterday in terms of VA for all, and what you've heard others say in terms of Medicare for all. And Republicans need to stop, and conservatives need to stop playing on the field that Democrats want us to play on, which is the false notion that coverage as a singular variable is the thing we should focus on the most. That is not what we should be focusing on, because crap coverage is still crap, and we need to stop pretending it's not. We need to focus like a laser on making sure people have access to the doctors of their choice, can afford it by driving competition, have access through health savings accounts to carry their insurance from one job to another and have portable catastrophic care, be able to go to health sharing ministries like many people are doing now to end run our broken system, which was broken even worse by Obamacare, and create a market like we do in every other facet of life, in food, shelter, clothing, and the basic necessities of life, and make it to where you can have 21st century iPhone-style healthcare. Instead of having what we have now, which is essentially single-payer healthcare being managed by insurance companies. You get sick, you have a problem, you call some bureaucrat who works for Aetna or Blue Cross in Omaha, Nebraska, who's 25 years old and is not a doctor, and that person looks at a schedule and says, that MRI will cost you $2,800. And you go, what? I can go down the street and get it for $400. Or you go to a doctor and the doctor says, well, don't worry, we'll take care of you. Your copay will be $240 and we're going to charge the insurance company $600. But then you go to a direct primary care doctor, and that doctor performs the same service for $45. Go talk to direct primary care doctors today, operating in Texas 21, who are providing great healthcare service at market rates that you can afford. Talk to health sharing ministries where people defray costs in collective communities. Talk to people who are at health savings accounts where you can save the money. And the last point on it is, we are in a broken system where the concerns about pre-existing conditions date back to wage controls after World War II, and the response was that employers started providing health care. And now when you lose your job or leave your job or choose to leave your job, you're worried about losing health care. Instead, you should be able to take your health care with you, just like you do your life insurance, just like you do your homeowner's insurance, just like you do your car insurance, and you can have that. Your employer can subsidize a health savings account, put that in there, and then you can keep the insurance. You can get a tax break on your insurance so that there's an equal playing field between employers and individuals who are self-employed. This is all possible, and we act like it's not. And we do that all because Republicans kind of ride behind the corner and say, ooh, pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions is a concern, but it is a small percentage of the overall market that we are turning completely upside down on its head when 90+% of the market is covered by employer-provided care, Medicare, Medicaid, and the private market. If we'll explode the private market, we can have the options that you would have in every other aspect of our life, and that's the solution to healthcare.
Couple more questions from me before we turn it over to the audience, and one of them is about another issue, and that's energy and environment policy. I think everyone in this room knows that one of the topics covered frequently in the media about DC right now is the Green New Deal. And as I was thinking about some questions to pose to you, I was reminded earlier today that on the day after your election, the Huffington Post called you a climate change denier, who's now in Congress. And so I'm wondering if you might want to respond to that, but also, perhaps even more importantly than addressing the label, talk to us about the substance of what a responsible energy policy would be.
Sure, no, and I appreciate that question. This label of a climate change denier, I'm not even 100% sure what that means. We live in a world of climate change. We do. And with the hostilities of the world that we get in terms of weather change, climate, temperature, and the forces that Mother Nature provides. It's a great blessing that we have the ability to do that. We had a hearing in the oversight hearing in the House of Representatives a couple of weeks ago, and John Kerry was there and Chuck Hagel, and they were there to testify at the invitation of my Democrat colleagues about climate change and the apocalypse that is likely upon us in 12 years. And so in questioning Senator Kerry, I asked, well, let me ask you this. You believe that we're going to have this sort of, apocalyptic kind of environment in 10 or 12 years? And he kind of went through and said, well, scientists will tell you that we're going to have some problems in 10 or 12 years that we should address. And he kind of danced around the apocalypse that my colleague from Brooklyn likes to talk about. And but he said, yeah, it's going to be a real problem we need to address. I said, great. So you'd be fine going to, 100% nuclear. right? If CO2 is the cataclysmic event that you say it is, then let's just go to all nuclear. Because whatever perils you have from nuclear surely aren't as important as the catastrophe that will befall us in 12 years because CO2 is polluting the climate. And the secretary, to his credit, or the senator, said, look, I'm a proponent of nuclear power, and I believe we should do it. I said, great, okay, we're in agreement on there. Do you believe we should have clean, abundant energy to improve the lives around the world for all of mankind, humankind? Yeah, absolutely, I do. Yeah, for the 2 billion people who don't have access to the kind of power that we do, for the babies that are in incubators in Ethiopia that don't have full power like we do, that you've got doctors squeezing bags as opposed to us having a fully powered hospital. We should try to export our clean, abundant energy. Yeah, I think we should have that for the world. Great. Do you believe in supporting liquefied natural gas and exporting it from the world, from the United States to the world? Yes. Senator Kerry agreed with that. Do you agree that we're reducing CO2 emissions in the United States by 25% because of our clean burning natural gas? Well, why, yes, that is true. These are the kinds of things you talk about, and you talk about how lives are improved around the world because we have access to clean, abundant energy. You talk about the positives of that. And that's what I think we should be talking about. Talking about whether or not a degree or two of impact about CO2 production, we're going around in circles. Because some people are going to say X and some people are going to say Y. I say, fine. If you believe that the production of CO2 is so cataclysmic, let's get busy embracing the policies that are going to actually change it for the world. Make India and China be more along the lines of the United States, which is leading the world in CO2 decreasing. And by the way, let's recognize that you cannot have the panacea be so-called renewable energy when you've got places like Georgetown that claim to be 100% renewable and are clearly not. And they're clearly now ruining what they sowed and trying to claim that they're 100% renewable, because you can't be 100% renewable. That's the truth. The fact is, the wind and solar we've got in Texas, we lead the nation in wind power. Yet at max, it's in that 15 to 17% range of our grid. At peak, it's less than 10%. And in fact, there's studies that show that when you reach it to a certain level, you're reducing your ability to be able to cover your power with renewable sources. Maybe we'll get there one day, but let the market bear that out. Right now, let's not fool ourselves into believing that you can power the world with this, and let's get busy doing what we know we can do with clean burning natural gas and fossil fuels.
Thanks for that response. I think what we'll do, since we're halfway through the town hall, if good with you, Congressman,
sure,
is move to some audience questions. So the way this works is we have a couple of TPPF colleagues who have microphones, one TPPF colleague, so there'll be a little bit of interlude. And he has a microphone, and I will recognize you, and Clint with the microphone will come up to you, and he's just going to hold on to the microphone so we can make sure we cycle through as many questions as you would like. And if this is the first time you've been here, then know that what's now known as the Roberts Corollary is aimed at no particular group at all. It is that please phrase your comment in the form of a short question. So that's a polite way of saying, if you're long-winded, I am, as politely as a Southern gentleman can, going to step in and ask you to get to your question. Please take no offense at that, because it can happen.
And if I might echo that, I'd like to get as many questions as we can in a reasonable period of time. So please do keep them short and brief. I'll answer as many as you want to throw at my way. I'm fine doing that, but let's try to get through them in reasonable time.
Excellent. Thank you, Congressman. You ready to go? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Do you know what happens to ice at 32.1 degrees?
You're going to tell me what cataclysmic event I'm about to hear about.
It melts, and that's 0.1 degrees. So when you just blow off 1 or 2 degrees and make fun of it being cataclysmic with a sneer, I offer to you 0.1 degrees can do a lot. So climate change is real. Thank you for attesting to that. But some of us are very, very concerned about what will happen, and we really hope that you'll advocate for us.
Well, appreciate the question. I'm of the belief that if there's a problem that we think exists because of climate change, we should look at it and we should address it. My view is that we are far better off, humanity around the globe, we are far better off with abundant, clean energy. Worlds and lives are made better. Human progress is exponentially higher. Life expectancy is longer. People live healthier and cleaner lives. If you overlay a map of free countries and free societies with a map of clean environments, there's a close to one-to-one correlation. I believe that if we promote clean burning energy and export it around the world, that we will far benefit as a society. I'm not going to get into the business of saying yes or no as to what impact may or may a certain amount of CO2 production may or may not have on the temperature of the earth. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to expound on that. What I'm going to suggest is we are far better off as a world with clean, abundant, available energy for as many people in the world as we can get.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, ma'am, for your question. Yes, sir. Microphone's coming down to you.
You know, on the issue of asylum seekers, why can't asylum seekers just go to the U.S. embassies in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala? Is there something I'm missing? Because wouldn't that solve a lot of the problems of human trafficking, sex trafficking, you know, the whole issue? Is there some reason we can't change the policy where they could just go to the U.S. embassy in those countries and eliminate a whole lot of the problems we're having down south?
Well, it's a good question. Under our asylum laws, people are supposed to go to the ports of entry or to embassies. They are not supposed to be coming between the ports of entry. In fact, it is a reason for us to be able to do not deny entry if people are coming between the ports of entry. Unfortunately, as we were trying to do that, a Ninth Circuit judge had an injunction on that, saying that we can't do that. The law is fairly clear that we can. The fact of the matter is, under asylum law, to your point, 99% of the people coming across our border are not going to qualify under the definition of asylum that's there for people who are being persecuted and have a credible fear of persecution in their home country. Rather, we've got a lot of people who are coming here because, God bless them, and I don't blame them, they want a better way of life. But importantly, the cartels are profiting by driving people here. There was literally and figuratively, by the way, there was a story in the either Tribune or Dallas Morning News in the last 48 hours chronicling a father and son who had come here from Guatemala and had talked about their journey, had talked about the difficulties of the journey, talking about paying a coyote, the difficulty of getting across the border, getting held in El Paso, then getting to Dallas, going through the whole process. And it was harrowing and it was troubling. We as a society should not like that there are migrants going through that kind of a path to come here. I might add, it is because we're allowing it to happen by not doing our basic duty as a sovereign nation to secure our border. We're not applying the appropriate asylum laws, and we're having catch and release policies that we shouldn't have in place that is encouraging people to come here and encouraging cartels to profit on it. We are not doing what we should do to process people quickly when we get here because we don't have the resources that are there when they do have a credible asylum claim. We need more resources at the border, which have been blocked repeatedly when we tried to have more resources. And these are the things that we could fix if we just took the action and had the will to fix them, if we had the right policies in place.
Thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
Okay. Appreciate you holding as many town halls as you're holding. I really genuinely do. It's a nice
good to see you
contrast.
again,
It's good
San
to see you
Antonio.
too, and I appreciate the civil level of engagement that you engage in and the opportunity to engage. I want to
Likewise.
clarify the point that the dialogue you had about climate, both at the end of the pre-question period and her point, because this seat was held, as you know, before by Lamar Smith, who I think fairly could be said spent the bulk of the last part of his tenure chipping away at the scientific, military, insurance, in fact, oil and gas leadership consensus that climate change is not only real, but it is caused by the release of carbon and the burning of carbon. Do you break with Congressman Smith? Is that what I'm hearing? That you acknowledge that there is a scientific, military, industrial, worldwide consensus that climate change is caused by carbon?
I do not believe that there is a consensus worldwide on that topic. There is a great deal of disagreement by very studied scholars about the nature of human impact on climate change and temperature changes in the globe. What I'm not going to get into is a back and forth about what human impact is and whatever degrees of impact that might be, when in fact, the whole notion that carbon is bad for us, I take issue with. Carbon is a basic building block of our life. CO2 is good for our planet. CO2 is in fact good for our planet. What the particular levels are that are appropriate for the well-being of the planet, there are a lot of people smarter than I am on both sides of the debate on this. There are people in the industry on both sides of the debate. There are scientists on both sides of the debate. And from my standpoint, it is an academic exercise in which we go around in circles where, in my view, we are, I will reiterate, far better off as a people, far better off with having abundant power, and that we should use fossil fuels that the good Lord gave us the best way we know how, with clean burning natural gas in this state, which is driving down CO2 production, if that is your goal, and export liquefied natural gas around the world to continue to reduce CO2, if that is our goal. And that if we do that, you're going to get far better results than in hanging on and clinging to the notion that we're going to have renewable energy power the globe anytime in the next 12 years of the supposed apocalypse that my colleague discusses. So from my standpoint, that's the best solution.
Thanks for your question, sir. Yes, ma'am. Right here, second row, Graham. Raise your hand again, ma'am. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I understand you've made fiscal sanity a big part of your messaging during your campaign. The deficit is obviously something that's a really big deal for everyone in this room, I imagine. And I've read articles about Rand Paul's penny plan. And I think I've heard you say that you support it. Could you talk a little bit about why you support Paul's penny plan?
So in broad terms, I support a approach that would actually focus on trying to balance the budget, okay? I will support any number of different approaches if anybody will just sit around a table and say, all right, there's a limit, we need to try to limit it, and we should operate under that limit. What happens today in Washington is that Republicans often, it's not always just Republicans and some Democrats, who very much want to support defense spending for often very good reason, because we're embroiled in conflict in the Middle East, because Russia and China are rattling with very serious potential consequences to us and the safety and security of the globe, that we believe we need to have stronger defense. Okay, that's a reasonable debate and discussion. Because of that, there's a quest to have more defense spending. So now we're at $708 billion last year, $733 in the Democrats' spending level mark, $750 billion in the president's budget and what came out of DOD. Meanwhile, then there's a question on non-defense discretionary spending. It will not surprise you that my Democrat colleagues want to see more plus up of non-defense discretionary spending. Meanwhile, both parties say, well, we've got to reform entitlements because mandatory spending is 70% of our spending problem. But when the director of the OMB was up in front of the budget committee and I was questioning him, I said, Mr. Vogt, you've heard people on both sides of the aisle here say that the real problem is mandatory spending, that's where we need to solve the problem. Meanwhile, don't worry about all this discretionary nonsense. I said, what was your response and your analysis as the director of OMB to the great plan that was put forward by both sides of the aisle, where they locked arm in the Capitol steps and they went in front of everybody and they introduced their plan and gave a big press conference? And Mr. Vogt kind of looked up and said, that never happened. I said, I know it didn't, because it never happens, because they won't do it. Because it's a lot easier for members of both parties to go and campaign on a balanced budget amendment, or go and campaign on the need to reform entitlements in this sort of vague sense, and then go back and say, but meanwhile, we're just going to bust the caps that are in place on discretionary spending, whether it's defense or non-defense discretionary. That's precisely what happened under Republican-controlled House, Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican White House the last 2 years, to the tune of $330 billion over the caps. When I asked the Democrat leader, Steny Hoyer, when he was testifying in front of the Budget Committee, I said, Mr. Hoyer, I'm new here. I don't come with any of the expertise or the baggage. I don't know, tell me. What I've heard here is that the problem is that you think it's bad if we don't increase the caps. We need to spend more. Okay, what happens if we just follow the caps? How much will our deficit spending be? And he turned around and looked at his staff, and his staffer said, $1 trillion. And Hoyer said, $1 trillion. That's what we're looking at. at a time when we're spending $100 million an hour racking up debt. Our debt is increasing $100 million per hour. And at the time we're sitting here in this discussion, another $100 million. By the way, for you who might be slightly hostile to my political view, I got PolitiFact checked on that one, and I got a mostly true. That's basically the Gospel of Luke when you get PolitiFact mostly true. So $100 million an hour. If you want to count to $22 trillion, and you set out and count one Mississippi, one per second, how long will it take you to get to 22 trillion? 700,000 years. If you count one per second.
Have you been PolitiFact on that too?
Not yet, but we've run the numbers a lot on that. So that's the deal. Now to the penny plan, to answer your question, I like the notion of the penny plan, but it is, I've not seen the updated version since the debt has gotten as high as it is. And it is something that I will consider and talk to my friends in Senator Paul's office about, and we're in the process of doing that to try to figure out what budget we would promote. By the way, my Democrat colleagues didn't even put forward a budget. I'm not sure what to do with that.
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. Yes, sir. But just wait for the mic if you don't mind. Thank you.
So, thank you for being here, Congressman. Speaking of campaigning, you know, this is kind of a tough question for people to answer, I think, when they have to campaign every 2 years. But on the topics of entitlements and then more federal laws, you know, a lot of so-called small government conservatives and Republicans will campaign on, you know, we need less laws, or we don't need more laws, or we need to reform our entitlements. And then once they get to D.C., we don't ever see any of that. So now that you've been in D.C. for a while, do you have any opinion on that? Is it because they are afraid that it's a campaign issue they don't want to touch when they come back, or, you know, why do they not seem to actually follow through with less laws and actual entitlement and spending reform when they get there?
Well, two slightly different topics, but related, about whether people fulfill their campaign pledges when they get to Washington on the notion of reducing the number of laws or the size and scope of government, I think is what you're getting at, and then very specific to the issue of Medicare, Social Security, mandatory spending, entitlement reform. In the general point, I believe to some degree it's the inertia of the town. You know, you go down to the floor of the House of Representatives, and the majority will put forward a bill that you may have just found out about that day what it was going to be voted on, because it came out of committee a long time ago. Maybe it didn't go through committee again this year. You have some information about it, but you're still trying to piece together what they put in there. And then you get, even by your own leadership, a motion to recommit that has some amendment in there that you haven't looked at until you literally get to the floor because it wasn't shared with you. And then you figure out what's in that. By the way, I've voted several times against my own party on some of those issues, trying to hold the line and believing that I think government should be smaller, or that I should stand on my principles on, for example, the Yemen vote and some other ones. And so there's kind of an inertia to the town on some of those things where just bills get passed. Another one that will no doubt come up by somebody in a question is, like, for example, the Violence Against Women Act. So I voted against the Violence Against Women Act. So I must clearly be a horrible person who supports violence against women, because that's what will be said. That's what the campaign commercials will be run. It's already being said. But my obligation is to defend the Constitution, to focus on what I think the people of this district want. And just because you title something like the Violence Against Women Act, and then bury in it a lot of things that are contrary to the principles of this district, doesn't mean you should vote for it. Yet I sat in a Republican conference meeting in which Republicans marched to the microphone in a private meeting saying, and I won't mention names because it was private, but marched to the microphone saying, well, I don't know if I can vote against that because it's, you know, Violence Against Women Act, I'll just get beat up in my district. Meanwhile, it's got provisions in it that they violently oppose, that they know that they believe is bad for their district and for the country. And yet, well, I don't know if I can vote against that. Why? Because it's titled what it's titled. That's Washington. That's the swamp. That's what people are sick of. That's what the president ran against. On the issue of entitlements and or Social Security, Medicare, it's just, look, Paul Ryan, I didn't always agree with him, okay? I disagree with him on a number of different levels. But credit to him where credit is due. He tried to take on figuring out a way to reform Medicare and Social Security, particularly Medicare. Premium support was his version of doing it. And there was some reasonable, I think, thinking behind that. Didn't agree with every aspect of it. But you will recall that there's commercials running about him pushing Granny off the cliff. Well, guess what? Granny is going off the cliff in 8 years because Medicare's out of money, because we have $22 trillion of debt, because our leadership won't do anything about it. And for those of you that are going to claim corporate tax increases and then raising taxes, you can't raise taxes enough. You cannot do it. You cannot raise taxes enough to pay for Medicare, to reform it and to get it to work right, to pay for what we need to do to get out of $1 trillion of debt. Right now, we are having 3.1% economic growth for the first time in my recent memory. We've had a decade of 1 to 2% economic growth. If you want to get our economy going, if you want to be able to pay off our debt, you have to have economic growth to do it. And by virtue of putting more money in the hands of the people of the United States, we're at a place where we have 3.1% economic growth again for the first time in a long time.
Thanks for your question. Sir, yes, you've been patient. Right there in the middle, Graham. Thank you. The mic's coming around to you. Thanks.
So you've been making various statements that are very specific about denying things like the use of wind energy, solar energy, things like that. Yet you claim not to be a scientist, and you're not able to make any claims on things like climate change and other things. How do you have this specific information, yet very, lack of information on other subjects that are very related? Is it that you're coached? Do you consult with different universities? If so, who are these universities? Where do you get this information?
Well, information is available in a number of different sources. Okay, well, I'll answer the question in my time. We get information from a number of different sources, right? All of us digest information from a number of different sources. News, think tanks, universities, industry, government. I'm not going to sit there and go through every report I've ever read in the history of my life. What I'm looking at is information that is in front of me, okay? The information that is available to us is a matter of public record about how much wind power is produced in our grid. Go look at the government record, it's there. It is not an enormous portion of our grid, despite the fact that Texas is the #1 wind producing state in the United States of America. The facts bear that out, it's proved. If you go look at what's happening in terms of the amount of energy that's produced, in terms of natural gas and our ability to produce energy here in Texas to export to the world, and what that will mean for CO2 production decreasing, if that is your end, if that's your aim, go look at the facts and it bears it out. Okay, well, study the reports that are out there and talk about how, and why John Kerry testified in a hearing there, in theory, to talk about the apocalypse of climate change, about why exporting liquefied natural gas is good for the world, why exporting liquefied natural gas is better for reducing CO2 around the world.
Sir, just stop there. I'm going to give you one more retort, and then we're going to wrap it up so we get to another question. So I'm going to give you the mic for 10 more seconds to ask a follow-up question. Thank you.
Okay, so again, you're not telling me where you get this information, and the reason it's important is because I've gone and I asked you where you get your knowledge, because it's not the knowledge that I've gotten. It's different.
So I've had very few people deny the fact that CO2 reduction in the United States of America is going down, and that it is going down in large part because of a conversion to clean burning coal, to clean burning natural gas, and that is driving down our CO2 production. There are very few people that have debated that. The same thing with getting liquefied natural gas around the world and the benefits that will provide to driving down CO2 production. And if you want to look at the university, fine, look at the sources that are out there in the world. They exist. You want to look at the University of Texas, talk to Scott Tinker. Talk to Scott Tinker at the University of Texas about what you get in terms of life powered around the world by looking at sources and where we get our energy supply. It exists, but it's hard to refute a grid where you can look at the data. The data's there. Look at our Texas state government data. That's all available for public consumption.
Thanks for the question, sir. Come down to this side of the room. Ma'am, you've been patient down here at the second row.
Hi, I wanted to ask for an update on your amendment to streamline the process for federal agencies to remove poor performers. I'm interested in that because my husband works for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and at the same time I work for private sector, we've had conversations for years about how ridiculous and onerous it is to hire and fire in the government, and it hampers effectiveness and efficiency in government departments.
Well, I appreciate that question. And what the lady's referring to is in the Oversight Committee, when we were voting on another measure that I can get into, but I offered an amendment that would have streamlined, as she roughly explained, the process for removal of poor performing federal employees. The data, wherever you read the data for these sorts of things, which I have enormous reports from the Department of Labor and Bureau of Statistics and stuff for the United States government, that the number of people that are removed from their jobs in government far less than the number removed from the private sector. It's not even close. It's like 10 to 1 if you look at the comparison. So this is part of the problem where you can't get productivity, because if you try to remove somebody, you have to go through a 6-month and 1 year and 18-month process for somebody who's not performing. That's not what we should have. For everybody in here, regardless of ideology, if you're sick of government, for whatever reason you're sick of government, and what performance you're getting out of government, that's a big part of the problem. So I offered an amendment, and it was voted down on party lines, as you would expect, in the committee. But I did so knowing it would be voted down to try to get continued discussion about that topic. I think it's a fundamental reform that ought to take place.
Hold on just a minute, ma'am. I'll give you a microphone for 10 seconds for a quick follow-up question.
I don't understand why the other side would not agree with that.
It is a employment protection response, and it is to say that you shouldn't be able to have anything close to at-will employment, and it's a protection of government employees. That's it.
Okay, come down to this side here, gentleman there. Mike's coming your way.
Kansas has what I would describe as healthcare co-ops, which in conjunction with large deductible insurance makes healthcare affordable, including the ability to dispense prescribed medications through these clinics. What can be done at the federal level to enable that sort of healthcare?
So what I love about the environment that we're in today, where the healthcare system is so constrained by regulation that it's not able to truly perform like a market, is that even in that environment, we've got a number of avenues that are truly end running the bureaucracy and the stranglehold that has on the market. And so you've outlined one of those, direct primary care. Doctors that are basically saying, I'm out. I'm not doing insurance provided care. I'm just going to the market and you pay me cash. What you describe in terms of co-ops, or what we might describe in other situations as health sharing ministries and health sharing organizations. I had a colleague, one that was here, who's now moved on, whose father was diagnosed with prostate cancer and had lost his insurance because of Obamacare. He lost his insurance in the wake of Obamacare, and then was forced into an environment where they needed to get care and coverage, and they got coverage through a health sharing ministry. Then they had to work through getting to MD Anderson for treatment, and then had to get in and explain that this was effectively insurance. Would they take it? They won that argument. MD Anderson took it. His care was taken care of and covered, and now he's doing well and had the coverage and care that he needed by getting it at MD Anderson. And he did that through this health sharing ministry. These kinds of features are able to spread costs. All of us, you get that kind of like catastrophic $2,000 or $10,000 or whatever bill that's not in your budget. You got to figure out how to defray that and deal with it. And you do that either through savings and savings accounts, or you do that through some sort of, sharing organization like that. Co-ops are one way, these health sharing ministries. There are many ways to do that. There are great studies about, in terms of insurance, being able to have insurance against being uninsured. Right, it's kind of like uninsured motorist in a sense, right? Where you're carrying a very small affordable policy along with your normal policy for catastrophic coverage that says no matter what, you'll be able to go out in the market and buy insurance at the market rate for a healthy individual, no matter what happens to you. There are lots of versions of the model that the market would produce if we would allow the market to produce it. I once was having a debate with one of my friends and another former TPPF guy, Hogsett Roy, and then another person who was kind of more on the left. Hogsett was sort of in the sort of center right middle, and I was kind of on the more right side, and then this woman was representing the very left-leaning view. We had a great discussion. She and I agreed that the Republican proposal in 2017 wasn't very good, and we didn't like it for very different reasons, I might add. But we had a great, robust discussion. But my favorite part was when she said, "Man, when you talk about the wild, wild west before Obamacare." I kind of paused and said, wait a minute, the wild, wild west before Obamacare. The Wild Wild West of healthcare that was under the Healthcare Management Act of 1973, UMRA, HIPAA, EMTALA. I mean, I go down a laundry list of alphabet soup of regulations that have constrained and micromanaged our health insurance system and our market-based healthcare, so much so that you can't recognize it as being actually market-based. And that, I think, is the problem that we need to address.
Thanks for your question, sir. We'll take one more question. Yes, sir, in the back.
President Trump, in addition to mocking the disabled and fleecing people in his business dealings, is a serial liar, adulterer, and bully, along with a long list of other unsavory character traits. Yep. As a Christian husband and father, how do you justify your support for such an unethical president, or does the end justify the means?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate you being here. I have steadfastly tried to call out the president when I disagree with the president. When I campaigned, and since, I've talked repeatedly about my belief that you put your faith in principles, not in princes. That is not a slight against the president or any member of Congress or anybody else that I work with in the state legislature or any position of power. It's just the truth. We're all going to be dead and gone, okay? And it's not going to take too long, in a glimpse of the eye. As a cancer survivor, I kind of stared down that, and your life perspective, and many of you who have dealt with illnesses and health issues have that same view of the world. I view the world a little bit differently now. And I don't get too hung up in the day-to-day rumblings about what somebody is saying or not saying in the way they're saying it. At the end of the day, when I disagreed with the president about the way he characterized John McCain's service, I publicly said so. That wasn't met with cheers from some ardent Trump supporters. At the same time, I'm also a fan of the president taking some actions that I agree with that I think are fundamentally important for the future of the republic, and agreeing with some of the policies that he's staking a position on. I believe border security matters. I believe reducing regulation matters. I believe having an open conversation about why we're still embroiled in wars 17 years into the use of an authorization of the use of military force is an important question for us to have. And I would hope that people here across the ideological spectrum would agree with that it's high time that we have a conversation about blood and treasure and $7 trillion, 70,000 injuries, 7,000 dead Americans, number of people suffering from PTSD and other issues. We should have that debate and that discussion, very much so, and I think that the president's right to raise that issue. You can agree or disagree with the way the president says and does things. I think there have been many great men in the White House and others that are less so. The history judges that. We'll make that decision over time and in years. But at the end of the day, I care about making sure that we've got a country heading in the right direction for the future for our kids and our grandkids, and that's how I try to make decisions.
Thanks for your question, sir. And for all of you, thanks for your decorum here tonight. We are out of time. I know there are some other questions. Congressman may be around and able to ask some of those questions. You certainly can do that if he's sticking around. I just want to thank you very sincerely for a wonderful civil conversation. If you were here for the first time, regardless of what your worldview may be, and I would say particularly if you have a difference of opinion with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we want you here. This is part of what we do. We believe that each of us can conduct ourselves in a way that's civil. And frankly, as a historian of this country, I think it's sorely needed. So thank you for being here. Congressman Chip Roy, thanks for being part of this. I'll give you one final word before we wrap.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Kevin. Thanks to TPPF. I know a lot goes into hosting an event like this. Thank you all for coming. I know and recognize some faces from across the district. Not all of you are within 5 minutes shouting distance here. So thank you for coming in for this. I will stick around and try to chat with as many people as I can. I would ask some forbearance. My son's Little League game is underway, and I'm going to try to catch at least the last couple of innings of it. But I will stick around and chat with a few folks before I try to head to catch it. So thank you all for coming.
Congressman Chip Roy, God bless you. God bless Texas. Yep.